It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to speak to this virtual colloquium, this fragmentary colloquium, on why gather the fragments.
Thank you, Hugh. Well, first I should apologize to everyone that I'm here under false pretenses. I normally wouldn't have dreamt of suggesting this paper to a group of text critics, except that Hugh dangled his coat in front of us in the call for papers and said, you might just want to deal with that text in Mark 6, 32 to 44, at the end of the feeding of the 5,000. And in Latin, of course, it's translated into a lovely short command, collegere fragmenta, collect ye the fragments. And I couldn't resist taking up his challenge because this has been a little hobby horse of mine for at least 20 or nearly 30 years. We are all more than familiar with the feeding of the 5,000 story in Mark's Gospel, Mark 6:32 to 44, and then the feeding of the 4,000 in Mark 8:1 to 10. We then usually immediately expand that to note that the 5,000 is one of the few instances that goes over all four canonical Gospels, and the 4,000 has been taken up by Matthew. My concern is that in keeping an eye on commentary on these texts over since the late 1990s, I've noticed that endless commentary is given to the nature and probable purpose of the miracle. There is still a very long debate, which began in the early 20th century, on whether, as the story is found now, it relates to one event or two, or is it simply a textual doublet? And if it is that, is it something that was already in Mark's tradition, or is it something that comes from Mark's own activity? So tradition versus redaction. This fascination with the miracle is, of course, entirely natural. The miracle story in every text is intended to draw attention to the miracle itself. So all our commentary focuses on why this miracle. And three themes keep recurring in commentaries. First of all, that the bread, the 5 loaves that have now fed the multitude are the new manna, and people explore what manna might mean within Mark's Gospel and then in the others. That the actual act of feeding so many is the new prophet. He is more than Moses, who gave the first manna. He is more than Elisha's feeding the 100 with 20 loaves. And invariably looking at the words, and words such as blessed and broke, commentators pick up Eucharistic overtones. This takes two forms. It says this is somehow proleptic of the Last Supper narratives, or it's proleptic of the Church's Eucharistic practice. I've always been worried about that because it strikes me that seeing it as proleptic of the Last Supper is no more than pointing out that all meals mentioned in the Gospels have certain common elements: blessing, feeding, so what? Moreover, there's been a tendency to either identify Last Supper with a very ritualized conception of the Eucharist, or indeed to think that the Eucharist must be imagined ritualistically. So I've suspected that it's just in desperation. There are links that comment is made. And I've been very pleased with reading the work of the SBL seminar on ancient meals, who have stressed the dissimilarity of meals and the Eucharist, but to my mind, they have often gone to too great an extreme, in that they imagine that a Eucharistic overtone would have to have a very clearly identifiable later liturgical component. And they usually pick a 4th or 5th century liturgical model, or indeed a model out of their own experience in the churches, and then say, but the meal is not that, and therefore it is not Eucharistic. So we have a group of commentators arguing, whatever it is, it must have Eucharistic overtones, and another saying, no, it cannot have Eucharistic overtones because Eucharist is a much later phenomenon. Now, while the SBL approach, I think, is very useful in debunking a lot of the pseudo-Eucharistic symbolism that people find in John 6, when it comes to the feeding miracles, I think it often ends up as so extreme that they forget that there was actual eating and drinking and sitting down together at the Eucharist. One other element of criticism is that what of the 12 baskets found in the 5,000 feeding miracles, and the 12 baskets are named, the 12 baskets of broken fragments are named in all 4 Gospels, or the 7 baskets of broken fragments in the feeding of the 4,000, which is mentioned in both Mark and Matthew. There's almost no interest in the fragments themselves, and it's usually pointed out that the Greek is rather awkward in Mark, but suddenly we go into the symbolism of numbers of 7 and 12. And of course, the problem with number symbolism is that once one enters into number symbolism as exegesis, the imagination usually takes off. And it can take off even in bizarre ways. My former colleague in Lampeter, Paul Badham, used the fact that there were 12 basketfuls after the event as the proof that a miracle could not have happened, and therefore Mark was a false reporter, and asked for this. Well, the proof was, unless they had already brought 12 baskets full of loaves, they wouldn't have had 12 baskets handy to collect the fragments. I'll leave that level of criticism aside. What is very strange is that almost no one commenting on the miracle stories ever relates them to the echo in the discourse that we call Beware of the Leaven of the Pharisees, that we find later in chapter 8, just 6 verses on from the feeding of the 4,000, in Mark 8, 16 to 21, with its parallel in Matthew 16, 5 to 12. Here we have in Mark another actual feeding situation on the boat. We have no bread. And the answer is, why are you worried? Did I not provide you with enough? And the question, how many baskets are over? Indeed, in verse 17, the fact that the people in the boat do not know the significance of the 12 baskets and the 7 baskets is linked into the messianic secret theme. They do not perceive, they do not understand, their hearts are hardened, and the key is in the number of the klasmata. Let's note the awkwardness of the problem. Since the story is a miracle story, why is there such interest in Mark, on 3 occasions, in the accident of the fact that there are fragments picked up? Even if we address it as a meal, one would expect a focus on the meal and what happened, not on the cleaning up after the meal. And while today we might think that it's very ecologically sound that they cleaned up after themselves, after having 5,000 people eating 5 loaves and 2 fish and being satisfied, it still strikes me as a useless detail. And yet, while we're silent in our commentary on it, it seems to be something that Mark is terribly interested in. So I wonder, has klasmata, I don't want to use the word Eucharistic dimension because I want to avoid both everything links to the Last Supper and I want to take on board the very real and useful warnings of the SBL seminar on early Christian meals. But we do know that the groups that Mark spoke to did meet together and did eat together. We also know that this meeting and eating together was problematic. Otherwise, we wouldn't have Paul's comments in 1 Corinthians. We infer from those comments and from other hints that we have that one of the major problems was shared status at these common meals. And I don't want to get involved in our common meals, Eucharistic or our Eucharist common meals. From my mind, all this is a single reality, but I leave that aside because it can distract us. So how, in a highly stratified society, and I'm thinking of all the work that the late Jimmy Dunn did on the world of Paul, and the question of who can share with whom. Could it be that they were actually familiar with a way of eating at their meal, which would seem to make sense, that they saw as following a Jesus pattern? In other words, they had certain ritual with a small r ways of eating together, which included, following from what we see in 1 Corinthians and the Didache, that they actually shared loaves. They were each expected to eat broken pieces. If we think of a community where one of their common actions, and indeed probably one of their distinctive common actions, was that they shared pieces of a loaf together, and now think of the status and who will eat with whom question, are we actually in a situation where Mark is giving a warning or an advice to the church in that calm way that he does on other occasions? I'm thinking of the way he deals with the issue of fasting, where he says, the fragments are very important, because look at the way Jesus says looking at the fragments is part of understanding his message. And is it a way of replying to people who would say something like, I don't want to eat fragments. I want to bring my own loaf. I want to eat my own bread. I certainly don't want to share from you, a klasma from you. And while I might be prepared to share with you, I will not be prepared for you to share with me. In a case where there are tensions, somewhat like what we see referred to in 1 Corinthians, and I'm thinking of these tensions as a species of the kind of tensions that Paul is answering, then Mark, in making repeated references to how many baskets were collected, and then understanding this is important, is saying every klasma matters. There is enough for all and more. Now, I'm aware that this is a rather desperate explanation, but in a sense, I am more interested in getting your reactions to the problem I've posed. I think my explanation does agree with their practical experience of their eating together. And this, to my mind, is the strength of my explanation. In support, I would say that the fact that Matthew, Luke, and John all keep the element of the 12 baskets that were collected after the feeding shows that for them, they knew it was of some importance and wasn't just a detail in Mark that in their own redactional activity they could omit. But if I have any hope from this little paper, it is, I hope I've drawn your attention to the problem of the fragmenta in the feeding stories. And if I've succeeded in doing that, and perhaps you will have the answer in a paper you will write, I'll feel I'll have justified the time I've taken from you today. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Tom. Well, we don't need to write papers to respond to you if there are questions which people would like to raise, either by typing in the chat or by raising their hand to pick up any of the many points or perhaps fragments that you've thrown out. So please either, if you click on the reactions button and find a way of raising your hand, or type something in the chat box, and I will pass the microphone to you metaphorically for ideas, questions, and feedback. Paul, I see your hand. So, I can see other hands being raised. Okay, Paul first, then Toynus, then Keith.
Tom, thank you very much for that. Always interesting to look in detail at these problems. Do you have any suggestion why Matthew may have kept two narratives for the 4,000 and the 5,000, but Luke and John, do they just think Mark has doubled up unnecessarily? Does John know Mark according to you? What do you think's going on with the later gospel writers and their use of the Markan traditions?
Well, I'll begin with why I think, why I suspect whether Mark doubles up or whether the double up exists already in Mark, to my mind, is an irrelevant question. But someone It's interesting that in Mark's Last Supper account, he uses the word thank and bless, which would render this problematic usage of barak and hodeh in Hebrew. And I suspect it's interesting that there's in the first miracle story, he uses thank, in the second he uses bless, and then in the Last Supper account he uses bless and thank. And I wonder, was someone actually trying to render this double aspect by doubling up the words? Matthew keeps the two of them together. Is that a case that Matthew actually understood something of Mark that the other two didn't? I think in the case of John, he only takes up fragmentary bits of Mark in any case. So I'm not answering your question, but I see it as part of a much bigger problem.
I mean, John's account, one could argue, has more Eucharistic overtones in one way, but John has no Eucharist or Last Supper in the Gospel. I mean, has John recognized those Eucharistic links, do you think? And more of a reason why he doesn't need a Last Supper account? It's intriguing. You've raised so many questions in my mind.
I've been very intrigued by Heilmann's article on the Bread of Life discourse, which came out, it was in SBL a few years ago. And I think he produced such a wealth of fascinating detail that I think he's gone even beyond what Meredith Warren in Sheffield has done in showing that is not, that the trying to beat John into a Eucharistic pattern set up by the Synoptics, I think doesn't work. But equally, for John, there is the great feast. And I think it's in the great feast imagery that he contains his Eucharistic discourse. So there is a Eucharistic discourse, but it looks very unlike the John 6 material, which we have historically and traditionally gone for to find Eucharist in John. I'm trying to remember the name of the lady who wrote the book on the Eucharist in John, and I don't want to get up and go rooting for it because I know that I'll wander around this room for the next 10 minutes and won't see it. But I can send it to you, Paul, I'll send it to you as an email afterwards.
Super, thank you. Now, next in line, Toynus, I said. If you unmute yourself. Toynus, we need you to unmute. That's
yes.
It.
Okay, thank you, Tom. I do have a question about why the remaining pieces of bread collected in the baskets. In the 2nd century, there were the rabbinic institution of the kupa, the basket, and the tamui, the kupa or plate for the support of the poor. Is the gathering of the leftovers after the meals a first stage of institutionalization of the support of the poor, comparable with the work of the deacons in Acts 6?
Well, Oleg, first of all, I want to say thank you, because I've never thought of it until now. Curiously, one of the symbolisms that is usually taken out of the number 7 baskets is that, since it's also used in Acts for the 7 deacons, people wonder, is there a link there? But apart from that number symbolism, and you probably gathered I'm always frightened about number symbolism because you can, I have just never thought of it until this moment, and I will go off and think about it.
Thank you.
It could very well be that we do know that there were institutions for the poor in the 2nd century. The most famous evidence for that is the collection in Justin Martyr's account. And it could be that the baskets are intended to be the collections for those who are either the poor or those who are not present.
Okay.
But thank you.
I'm thinking about this because of even the dogs are eating the little pieces
Yes.
of the meal. And we do have the parable of Lazarus, who is always asking for pieces of the meal of the rich. Maybe.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I'm writing down the notes.
Well, one of the joys of the colloquium is the chance to have a conversation. The third person to stand in line for the question was Keith, to whom I pass now. But don't forget, if you're able to stay until after the second paper, there will be more opportunity for discussion then, as long as Tom is prepared to stay. So Keith, last question to you.
Well, just a quick one, if I may, please, to Tom. If I correctly understood, you were suggesting that Mark is addressing a large group of early Christians. Do the figures 4,000 and 5,000 mean the same from that point of view, or not? Is there a significance in those numbers 4 and 5, or just a large number of people?
It has the significance of the figures has attracted immense amounts of commentary. There is an SBL. There's an SNTS paper from the 70s or 80s, which works out that it's all to do with particular ratios going back to Elisha's feeding 100 with 20 loaves. And my own feeling is that it's just a big number, and the reason one is 4,000 and one is 5,000 is to make sure that for the reader of Mark, they realize they're two separate events. I think it's just a very low. I think it's no more than saying when colloquially we say, oh, there were millions at something, or there were thousands at it. We don't know whether it was 900 or 1,200. We use it. I think my own feeling is that there are two events, big numbers at each, therefore wondrously miraculous. I haven't been convinced by any of the decodings of the numbers.
Great. Well, thank you again, Tom. And thanks to everybody who's contributed questions and comments.